Well, Ofer, thank you so much for coming back to the show. And we're going to talk about how the music charts and the music industry is manipulated and how certain genres of music are introduced into the culture and into society. And why don't you give us a little background on how you came about putting this presentation together?
Well, hi, Mike, and thanks for having me on your show once again. I think the last time was a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, in the summer of 22. And today what I wanted to present is a view on how songs are becoming or not becoming popular, and take a look at how the industry basically collected the data and decided what songs will be on top of the charts. And the reason for this is because you, in several of your presentations, not only discussed the Beatles story, but also the broader side of the music industry. And this is also related to some of the comments made in memoirs, which I'll get into in a second. And basically, when we were, buying records in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was great music, but we were, as music fans, were focusing on the music side. But obviously, there was also a business side. And the business side, what we know now, what we know today, is, well, if the music was great, I say that the business side was not that great. And I'll try to show my findings today so that the audience can see. And for many of us, I know for you and many other of your listeners, music was everything. We listened to the radio, we loved the songs that we hear. We went into the record stores and bought singles and albums of the bands and artists that we loved. But now in hindsight, we find that many of the things were not as the way that the industry presented them to us. And I want to just to very quickly mention or read a comment from the 2021 edition of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, page 266. With the control held by the super elite over all large radio stations, they had full control over which songs would make the top 20 and how each would rank. They decided against making Penny Lane a #1 hit in the UK. And a little further down, in his later hits, referring to Billy, without that level of assistance, the elites directed the stations to spin his records enough times to make them #1 hits for the prescribed duration. Currently, with personalized music stations, the public has much more control over what they hear. With logarithms based on individual preferences, we can now make our own top 20. So this comment, really struck me and really opened up, the gates for doing some research outside of the book. And in today's presentation, we'll discuss a couple of aspects showing the type of manipulation that went on behind the scenes of the music business. And our point of view is of music fans and music consumers, but also of critical thinkers who are trying to analyze pieces of information about the industry and think about what we were presented with back in the day. Now, the title of my presentation is also it's taken from a famous Public Enemy song, which is called "Don't Believe the Hype." Now, the word hype actually has two meanings. The noun refers to an extravagant or intensive promotion or publicity. So this is one definition, which refers to the promotion of songs. But it also became known as hyping which refers to the faking of record sales data, which is also something that happened in the music industry, and we'll talk about it today. And I will show examples of such a manipulation, and we can discuss it, of course. And that's basically it. And by the way, some of the sleeves in the presentation are from my singles collection, and I'm sure many of the listeners would recognize these songs. So that's basically it, and I'm ready to begin.
All right, slide number 2.
So the presentation has 2 parts. The first part, we will talk about measuring a song's popularity, but fixing the numbers. This is about the manipulation of the music charts. We'll have an overview of how the industry measured singles for popularity. Then we'll discuss the music business, the market's players and their interests, agendas, and pressures. Then we will talk about a very famous case, which is the payola scandal. Then I'll have 2 stories of how the charts were rigged, songs by the Beatles and Engelbert Humperdinck, and then another case where the Sex Pistols were competing with a Rod Stewart single, and more stories of how the industry was trying to control the sale of singles. So this is part 1. Part 2 will discuss punk rock, which was a major genre of music in the 1970s. And in hindsight, I will try to present the case that punk rock was manufactured. And we will talk about the theory of manufactured musical genres, which is something that you mentioned in several of your presentations already. Then we will show the case in point how punk rock was manufactured. The next segment will be about the story of the Sex Pistols, which is the signature punk rock group. And finally, we will conclude with more punk icons and how the industry supported them. That's basically the features in this presentation.
Okay, very good. So I'll move to the next slide now, Ofer. Yes?
Okay. So we begin the presentation with part 1, which is measuring the song's popularity, but fixing the numbers. And I wanted to begin with some background on radio, because radio was and still is a major part of the measurement of popularity of songs. So we have a map of the USA, of course, on the right side. And ratings basically determine radio and television advertising rates. And ratings are the estimated audience size of a specific television or radio program. The USA is divided into 210 media markets based on each territory's population. For example, Greater New York is the #1 market simply because it has the most population compared with all other markets, which is 8.5 million. Los Angeles is second, Chicago is third. Rochester, New York, for example, is counted separately. It's the 76th market in terms of population. And Glendive in eastern Montana is the number 210 and the smallest final commercial market with only 5,000 people. Now, the reason I'm talking or presenting this is that people, everything will be understood once we go through the next slides, but radio audiences are very critical, used to be more critical in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, when we were talking about the manual age of calculating popularity of songs, and I'll explain it as we go along. And just to conclude this page, radio stations operate within a known area and compete with other local radio stations. So this is just a very, simple background on radio. And we can move on to the next slide. Now, the music business has, in my opinion, 5 major players. So the headline here says the music business, the market's players, and their interests and agendas. So we have 5 main players, which are artists, record companies, record stores, radio stations or networks, and their DJs, and Arbitron. And let me just go very quickly discussing each of these players. So obviously artists, we're talking about singers, we're talking about groups or male or female artists. Many of them want to realize their artistic value and become successful. There are others who just want to become rich and famous, which is okay, I guess. The second player are the record companies. These are the entities which want to sell more records, make profits, and promote social agendas. And then we have the record stores, the retailers who want to sell music products, singles, albums, etc., and merchandising to make a profit. Obviously, we had lots of record stores in the manual period before the digital period, because now music can be bought online, of course. But back in the day, before everything went digital, record stores were very important because this was the place where music fans can consume and buy their records. And there are two more players, which we'll see in the next slide. We have obviously the radio stations or radio networks and the program directors and DJs. So radio stations, they want to increase ratings, which would increase revenues and profits from advertisements. They're competing. There's competition from other radio stations. They wish to make listeners tune into the station for as long as possible, so the ratings would go up. Now, many radio stations' promotions are all about making audiences stay and continue to listen. Examples from the top 40 stations: we play 10 songs in a row and with no commercial interruptions. Or, although they are called top 40, they mostly play the top 20, so listener can hear the top tunes on repeat and more frequently. Now, this type of programming was very popular with the two main pop stations in New York, WHTZ, which is Z100, and WPLJ. I'm going back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, of course. So radio stations, again, and we will see it later in this presentation, are a major force, or used to be a major force, in order to calculate a song popularity. And finally, the fifth and final player is Arbitron. Now they're called Nielsen Audio because Nielsen bought them. Arbitron measures radio stations' rating across the USA. For many years, Arbitron selected random listeners and paid them a small amount of money to report on their listening habits. The chosen listeners fill diaries with what they listen to and for how long. In 2007, the company introduced portable people meter. Such meters digitally track what people listen to. So that's just basic, some basic information about the players in the music industry.
No, very good, Ofer. Want me to move to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, the connection between record companies and radio stations. So in the early days of American radio, there was a clear connection between the two industries. As RCA, the pioneer in the recorded music business, formed NBC, which was the first network of radio stations across the USA. So we already see a record company which records and promotes artists, also forming the network of first radio stations across the USA. However, the radio industry was regulated through the formation of the FCC, and competing networks to NBC, such as CBS and ABC, were allowed to operate. In addition, during the post-World War II era, those three networks switched their focus to the television business, which was deemed and in fact was more lucrative in terms of ads or income from advertising. And other radio networks, such as local stations, began to operate. So we see that more and more radio stations are joining the market. And one final comment about radio: prime time in television refers to the 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock hours every day or every evening. In radio, prime time equals drive time. The two daily periods when audiences listen to the radio the most are the morning and evening rush hours, when people are in their cars, which is 6:30 to 9 a.m. and 4 to 7 p.m. on weekdays. So this is just a little bit about background about the connection between the record industry and radio stations. Now, move to talk about the measurement of music consumption. So we were listening to music on radio, and we were buying singles and albums in the stores. And we'll see in a second how that translated into the measurement of music consumption. But we have to go a little bit back and begin with sheet music, which basically was the very first method by which audiences could buy music, a music-related item of tunes they heard in the theater or on the radio. And we're going back to the beginning of the millennium, not this millennium, the other former millennium. In 1913, Billboard magazine, which was established in 1894, started to print the first ever best-selling sheet music chart called Last Week's 10 Bestsellers among the popular songs. So they were getting reports from music stores selling sheet music to determine which was the most popular sheet music sold, or which was the most popular tune that people were buying in the stores. This is before, of course, the record period or the vinyl period, which we'll get to in a second. So moving into the sound recording era, jukeboxes became popular in the 1940s, especially in the 50s and the 60s. It was one of the earliest ways the public paid to hear a song. And Billboard managed to measure it and published a record chart measuring jukebox plays during the 1950s. Now we go into measuring music consumption phase 2. In the post-World War II era, in the late 1940s, the music industry saw several dramatic changes, among them the creation of the pop market or the pop business. Some of those changes included the introduction of new vinyl formats, which is the 7-inch single and the 33-inch LP, both formats replacing the 78-inch format. We saw the growth of record stores selling the new vinyl formats to the masses, the initiation of the top 40 radio format. Many radio stations across the USA adopted this format, which stands for popular music. And then we have the measurement of singles and albums popularity through music charts beginning, and the introduction of new genres of music, such as rock and roll, and artists to promote social agendas, and the need for record companies to recoup their investments. So all of these changes are post-World War II, late 40s, early 50s, and we're now in a totally different era for music and music consumption. Now, there are basically two known systems of measurement. The rest of the world, I'm talking about South America, Europe, Australia, of course. We're talking about sales only. So whatever people buy in the stores accumulates every week and is shown in a popularity chart, which basically is the music chart. But in the USA, from the very beginning, there was another system which combined sales in stores and radio airplay. So songs received points not only from sales in stores, but also from how many times they were played on the top 40 radio stations. So here's a little bit about the music industry in the post-World War II era. And I'm reading from the top of the page. In outside of US territories, which compile weekly data based on sales only, record companies try to manipulate sales figures in various ways. And we will show and discuss some examples later in this presentation. In the USA, compiling weekly data began as early as the 1930s by Billboard magazine. But in 1955, a new version of the chart was created to reflect the new era. So on November 12th of 1955, we have the first weekly, the top 100 chart being introduced. And the chart blended data from 3 separate charts that were already published, which were the best sellers in stores, most played by jockeys, radio play, airplay, and most played in jukeboxes. So these 3, and sheet music was already taken out because it was no longer considered to be a major place where people consume their music. So we have a blend for the first time in November of 1955 of three separate charts, sales in stores, radio airplay, and jukeboxes. On August 4th, 1958, so 3 years later, after dropping the jukebox chart, Billboard renamed the chart the Hot 100, now consisting of sales in stores data combined with radio airplay. Now, collecting the data back in the 50s and 60s was done by phoning record stores all across the USA and getting data from shop owners. They would run diaries, notebooks, to detail sales for two purposes: running their inventory as well as summing up weekly sales and reporting them to Billboard, the music magazine. Cashiers were not digital back then, so all purchases were written down with all information into notebooks. Now, I don't know, Mike, if you recall, just before you go into the next slide, when you went to record store to buy a single on an album, and the cashier was printing the dollar amount, it was also, they had these huge notebooks. I don't know if you recall that, but I remember that vividly, and they will literally write down every copy of every single and every album that somebody purchased. And then they would, every week they would calculate by hand the total sales for each single and each album, and then report them. I know this is very strange today for people to, but this was how it was done. And I remember that for buying singles in Miami and also in New York later. And this is what the cashiers had to do. And again, for two purposes: for knowing their inventory at all times, and also for reporting to Billboard.
Now that you're mentioning this, I do remember back, let's say the mid 60s, when I bought a record or a 45, the person behind the counter was jotting something down.
So I took notice of it because the cashiers were not digital. We will talk about it in a second, because this changed in the 1990s. But this was how everything was written down, and was calculated back in the day. Now, so all of the introduction I did about radio, now I want to make it more clear. Top 40 radio plays a big part. So the top 40 radio station also reported the most played songs to Billboard weekly. Airplay is how frequently or how many times a song is being played on a radio station. Songs that succeed usually appear on a radio station's playlist, as radio station needs to constantly take listener surveys in order to figure out which songs to play more, because they knew if they played the songs that the people requested, that listener requested, they would obviously increase the amount of listenership to the station. Now, before the digital era, stations managers wrote the number of plays each song received. Then they reported such information to Billboard every week. As songs needed to accumulate points from both sales action and radio airplay, Billboard kept shifting the ratios between the two factors. So it was not always 50-50. They changed it all the time due to popularity or other factors, which I don't know, I couldn't find information about. However, radio was always a key factor in a song's success or failure, at least until the streaming period began. Now, just one side note, which I found very interesting. Sometimes record companies would issue double A-side singles. So how did they chart? So interestingly enough, singles that were promoted as double A-side singles or double A-sides, due to record companies wishing to give music fans some extra value for the purchase, ended up charting separately in the USA. The difference is the amount of airplay on each side of the single collected. So let me just explain it before I give the example. Mike, as you know, most of the singles we bought, and most of the singles, they had an A side, which is was the main song that the record companies were trying to promote, and then a B side, which is a song which was not that important, or they didn't want to promote it. But there were exceptions with the release of double A sides. For example, this single by the Beatles, by the way, many of the Beatles singles in the USA were released as double A sides. Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby. You see both titles on the sleeve of the single, and not only one of them. And I keep reading on the top, on the bottom of this page. The Beatles double A-side single Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby charted separately. Yellow Submarine reached number 2, while Rigby reached only number 11. The difference was due to Yellow Submarine collecting more radio airplays. This policy ended on November 1969, when Billboard decided the double A-sides would from now on be listed together on the charts. So this was interesting. I mean, radio stations played Yellow Submarine more. So it received more points and reached a higher rank on the Billboard chart than Eleanor Rigby, although they were sold as one single. So I thought this was interesting.
This is interesting because you would think that Eleanor Rigby, which is a much better song, would have been more listened to, and here we have the more childlike song, Yellow Submarine, taking the top spot.
I agree, but that's what we have in the record books. Yellow Submarine reaching number 2, and Eleanor Rigby reaching number 11. And the difference again, radio airplay. Now, music industry pressures led to illegal fixes. So in the USA, due to the system of compiling figures from sales in stores, as well as the amount of radio airplay songs were gathering, and due to record managers being pressured to recoup their investments in artists, this happened. Music managers used to offer stations kickbacks or freebies, which were in fact bribes. The deal was, play a specific song more often, and I, the record company's manager, will compensate you directly without anyone knowing. And I will show examples of cases that were actually publicized about this wrongdoing. Now, once this illegal exchange took place, certain records gained a lot more airplay, and that caused those songs to advance in their chart positions. Their illegal base exposure led them to enjoy a perceived popularity, and I will explain that in a second. And all of this took place regardless of the quality of the song. So if a song is being played more on the radio, and we the audiences don't know it, but some of these DJs or station managers received money in order to promote it more, it gains more points, and then we see it climbing the chart. And if you were listening, or people who were listening to American Top 40, the syndicated radio chart show back in the day, or to other chart shows, and they see that the song is a top 10 or top 5, they see it that it became very popular. So this is a perceived popularity, because now they say, oh, this is a very popular, maybe I should go and buy it in the store. So this is like perceived popularity, which is, what I mean is it's not necessarily the real popularity of the song, because the airplay was hyped. And we will discuss it in the next slides. More illegal fixes until the switch into digital. So we are still in the manual and not the digital era. Now, all that has changed when the industry moved from manual to digital reporting. In 1987, Billboard became a subsidiary of media conglomerate BPI Communications. Around the same time, BPI acquired Broadcast Data Systems, BDS, which invented a computerized radio airplay monitoring system. An encoded audio fingerprint made tracking songs airplay easy. Based on Arbitron data, the calculation then was each play of a song multiplied by the number of listeners at the time of play. So the ranking of songs was based on such calculation, resulting in the total impressions of the songs played. So now we have a digital system, a digital tracking system, which supposedly is more regulated, is more real, although obviously, there could be also wrongdoings about that, but it's very advanced since the system in the manual time frame. The switch to digital is now complete. So in 1991, the record industry completed the switch to digital monitoring, with Billboard starting to use SoundScan. Thus began the video SoundScan era, or the digital phase of the music industry. So we already have the radio digital tracking, and now we have SoundScan, which basically, keep reading the next paragraph, the new point of sales technology was introduced, enabling digital scan of every record sold. So retailers were serviced with POS cash registers, and from then on, each item sold could be properly accounted for, significantly reducing errors and inaccuracies. So if you go to a cashier, you would see the store manager or the person holding a scan and scanning the barcode on the single on the record. So this began in 1991. Further and more recent developments, streaming, YouTube music videos will not be discussed here, as they are not the main concern of this presentation. We will mainly deal with the pre-digital era or the manual era. And finally, Memoirs commented that controlling the music industry's numbers was easier before the switch to digital. So let's go back and revisit the manual time period and check this claim. Going back to the manual time period. So before digital, there was manual, with lots of opportunities for the industry players to control the numbers and advance certain artists and songs. The most famous music industry bribe case was the American Payola scandal, but we will also mention two other publicized cases of fixings in the UK, cases that we have the sources for and ones which most probably did take place. There have probably been more cases of pay for play in the music market, but since we don't have information or solid information, we will only discuss the publicized cases, and we can all think about the ramifications of these cases on the music industry and of us as consumers. So let's discuss the Payola scandal. In the music industry, payola is an illegal practice of paying a commercial radio station to play a song without the station disclosing the payment. So the rule is simple. If you disclose a payment, just as radio stations do for advertising, then all is fair and legal. But if a station or a DJ were paid to advance a song's airplay and did not disclose receiving such payment to their audiences, then such action is illegal. If there is no disclosure, the FCC deems such action as a violation of the sponsorship identification rules. And I know that you were listening to radio station, and many of your listeners used to listen to music on radio back in the day. Before you go into a commercial, the DJ would say we're going to a commercial, or there would be a jingle saying we're going to a commercial, because they had to do it. But there was never a case where a DJ would disclose being paid to promote the song, obviously, because this was simply illegal in terms of the FCC regulations. The Payola scandal, let's talk about what took place. So from Wikipedia, before the 1950s, 8 agencies that funded NBC's TV and radio shows, such as Your Hit Parade, refused to reveal how they calculated the song's popularity. Early attempts to stop payola were met by silence from the publishers, implying that the control system was already in place in the early days. Now let me explain that, this paragraph. There was a radio show and then a television show called Your Hit Parade, where artists were invited to sing those songs, but we, the public, did not know why these artists, were invited. And obviously they had either the interest of the people who wanted to promote them. And we recall that RCA started NBC, and NBC, which was the first network, they had this show, Your Hit Parade. And again, this is from Wikipedia. Early attempts to stop payola were met by silence from the publishers. So we don't know, again, we saw, if someone was watching this, was listening to this show on radio or watching this show on television. We didn't know why these artists, were there, but obviously they were there because somebody wanted them to be there. That's my point. In the 1950s, independent record companies or music publishers frequently used payola to promote rock and roll songs on American radio. Phil Lynn from Chicago's radio station WAIT disclosed in a congressional hearing that he received $22,000 to play a song. Again, everything that's in my presentation was stuff that we have the sources to. The congressional investigations and hearings on payola began in 1959. As a result, radio DJs were prohibited from making any decisions as to what to play, and such responsibility was handed over to program directors. Now they became the ones to try and bribe. Record labels they then found a loophole in the FCC regulations and started hiring independent third parties, leaving them to pay and plug their records. And this illegal operation, according to Wikipedia, stopped only in 1986. So we see in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and all the way through the mid-80s that something was going on, at least on some of the songs that were promoted illegally.
So, Ofer, the $22,000 was not paid to the radio station. It was paid directly to the DJ?
Yes. And then the FCC caught that. And after the hearings, and they issued new rules, and they made the program directors in charge. But now program directors were the one that record companies were wooing in order to promote some of the songs. As I mentioned here in the last paragraph, again, this is from Wikipedia, there were a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. So if you or I or any of our listeners were listening to radio songs in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there's a chance that some of these songs were not aired due to their quality or to their popularity, but because somebody was, being paid to promote them and to play them more.
Very interesting.
And the FCC investigated it and continued to investigate it and issuing new rules. But we see that this continued all the way up to the mid-80s, which is amazing. Now, let's talk about the payola scandal. Actually, it's the story of two very famous people, two legends. The 1950s payola scandal is also remembered as the story of two very famous music industry legends, Alan Freed and Dick Clark. Both were involved in the scandal, but when the investigations into their operations were finished, Freed and Clark witnessed a very different outcome. So let's talk about Alan Freed first. Born 1921 and he died in 1965. He was a very famous radio disc jockey. He began in Ohio in the early 50s, playing mostly R&B and rock and roll records. In fact, I think that he's the guy that is credited for naming R&B records as rock and roll records for the first time. At the same time, he promoted dances and concerts featuring artists that he played on the radio. So he was basically, holding the stick from both ends. He was airing artists and songs on his radio shows, which were very popular. And then he was also promoting the same artist in concerts. He was a promoter and a manager. Now, in 1954, he moved to New York and had a show on WINS, 1010 AM, which was back then a pop rock station until 1965. Since then, it became a very famous all news station, I think, up until today. He also managed concerts with artists he played on his shows. And he later had radio programs on other New York stations.
So he was a big-time player.
Yes. And he was at the center of payola. You see on the top right side a first page from the Sunday News. WABC fires Alan Freed in the payola probe. On the left side we see his gravestone. And in 1958 and 1959, he worked for a year and a half at WABC in New York, which is a very popular radio station, but he was fired after refusing to sign a statement for the FCC that he had never accepted payola bribes. In 1960, payola was made illegal in the USA by the FCC. In December of 1962, after being charged with multiple counts of commercial bribery, Fried pled guilty to 2 counts of bribery. He was fined $300 and received a suspended sentence. And in 1964, he was indicted by a federal grand jury for tax evasion and was fined $38,000 in taxes on income he allegedly did not report. Most of that income was said to come out of payola sources. He died in 1965 at the age of 43 due to health complications caused by alcoholism. So Alan Freed was the first, or one of the 2, I think, most famous people that was at the center of payola.
It's interesting. I didn't know he died at such a young age.
Yes, maybe some of our older listeners remember him, but he was, a big star back in the day. Very famous DJ.
Yeah, he was.
And then we have Dick Clark, which I think many of the listeners here know. We see on the top left corner a headline from one of the newspaper, DJ Clark wanted a payola probe. So Dick Clark, born 1929 and he died 12 years ago, 2012, was the other famous person to be linked to the payola scandal of the late 1950s, but he managed to come out of it with no charges. Clark was an American TV and radio personality who was mostly famous for hosting ABC Network's American Bandstand for 33 years, from 1956 to 1989. This show gave many artists their first ever exposure to national audiences and introduced rock and roll to teenagers and their parents as well. Now, Clark also owned, and I put an exclamation mark, 2 radio stations in California, in addition to his several announcements duties on radio and television. When payola investigations began in 1960, Clark was checked for his involvement in the scandal. His personal investments in music publishing and recording companies was considered a conflict of interest. So he sold his shares in those companies and was never charged. So unlike Alan Freed, he basically just got rid of some of his businesses and remained in television and in radio. I think the American audience is also known for the New Year's Eve show from New York, with the ball dropping down. And he was a very famous television producer, but I think his main show is American Bandstand, which I don't know if you watched as a kid, but it was quite popular on television, on American television.
Yeah, I used to watch it as a kid, but even Alan Freed pretty much got a slap on the wrist, considering what he was involved in.
Yeah. Now we move from the USA to the UK, and I want to mention a couple of chart fixes or two publicized stories of alleged chart fixes in the UK. So let me just briefly give an overview of the record charts in the UK. Record charts in the UK began in 1952, compiled by a weekly magazine, New Musical Express. Then there was a second music magazine, weekly, Record Mirror, a rival music magazine, which started compiling its pop charts in 1955. Rival publications, Melody Maker in 56 and Disc in 1958 began printing their charts as well. In 1960, Record Retailer, a fifth newspaper, began printing its pop sales chart, which has been the official chart of the UK music industry ever since. Record Mirror stopped compiling its own chart and started printing Record Retailer's chart instead. So I don't want the audience to be confused. Let's just say there was a major industry chart, which was the Record Retailer, and then there were other alternative music charts. And the reason Record Retailer became the main chart was it was reported that Record Retailer had no affiliation with record companies and therefore was less hyped than the other two charts, which was Enemies and Melody Makers. Until February of 1969, when the British Music Research Bureau, the BMRB, was established, no official UK chart existed. So there were all kinds of music charts in the papers. Now, Record Retailer and the BBC commissioned BMRB to compile the official chart, which began in 1969. So from 1969, we have one official chart, the one that the BBC is using. And before that, we have all kinds of music charts. But the industry still uses the record retailer from 1969 and backwards. So those of us, I have several of the UK chart books, and it's all the way record retailer. So this is how they would compile, and I'm going to read the last paragraph on this page. Each week, 250 record stores were randomly selected out of a pool of 6,000 nationwide to prevent fixes in the numbers. The stores chosen were not notified in advance to avoid fixes. However, there are two cases where we have sources alluding to possible tampering with the chart figures, and I will show them next. So case number one is something we discussed before, Mike, and this is also mentioned in memoirs. And this is the case of the Beatles competing with Engelbert Humperdinck for number one. So on the left side, you have the single, the double A-side single with Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. And then on the right side, you have Engelbert Humperdinck with Release Me. So in March of 1967, the Beatles entered the UK charts with the double A-side single Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. For the first 3 weeks of March, the Beatles single stalled at number 2 and never went to number 1 behind Engelbert Humperdinck's song Release Me. So for the first time, after 11 consecutive number 1 singles on the UK charts, the Beatles failed to reach number 1 with a single containing 2 of their classic songs. After failing to reach number 1, the Beatles had 6 more singles reaching number 1 in the UK. So this was a very, very odd case. I could never figure it out. But then we have memoirs. So for many years, it was not known what happened with Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. But in the memoirs of Billy Shear's book, the story is mentioned with an explanation that stalling the single was done on purpose to show the new version of the group with Billy that there is no guarantee for their further success and that they need to keep working and release music. So the Beatles, they entered, I think, at number 5. Then there were 3 weeks stalling at number 2, while Engelbert Humperdinck was still number 1. And then the single began to drop. So Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever never made number 1 in the UK. And what's implied in memoirs is the enormous help that the Beatles received from behind the scenes with the chart positions in music. They had 17 UK number 1s between 1963 and 1970. But we see that such a control can also most probably work against them in the case of Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, the single. Next slide. Okay, then we're jumping to 1977, late May and early June, with 2 singles competing for number 1. We have God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols, which I'll explain and talk about in a second. And on the right side, we have a double A-side single from Rod Stewart. I don't want to talk about it. And the first cut is The Deepest, which is a cover of a famous Cat Stevens song. Now, before I dive into this, Mike, can you go back just for a second? I'm sorry. I have something interesting to to show you and the audience on the Rod Stewart cover. Notice something interesting on the Rod Stewart singles cover. He is shushing. You see, he's holding the Be Quiet sign on his mouth.
Yeah, the Masonic tell no secrets.
I have a multiple choice question for you and the audience, Mike. 1, is he giving us this sign in relation to the song's lyrics? I don't want to talk about it. How you broke my heart. Option 2, is he telling us that the big scandal is about to happen with this competition with the Sex Pistols single? Number 3, is he giving us the tell no secret sign, letting us know that he is in the club? And number 4, all of the above.
Could be all of the above.
Well, obviously, I'm joking. Something to think about. By the way, Rod Stewart was knighted in 2016 when he became a sir. But let's go back and talk about the very strange manipulation on these 2 songs and how they competed. So in May of 1977, the UK celebrated Queen Elizabeth's Elizabeth 25th reign, which was called the Silver Jubilee. She was knighted in 1952, so 25 years later, the UK celebrated the Silver Jubilee. Now, the punk rock group, the Sex Pistols, released their single God Save the Queen, protesting the Queen's reign. The song's lyrics were very provocative. Not only was the title of the song similar to the British national anthem, but the lyrics were harsh, calling the monarchy a fascist regime. The single's cover used the defaced Queen's face, covered with the song and band's titles, so to also cause controversy. The song was immediately banned by the BBC and most other UK radio stations due to its treasonous sentiments. But once the media reported such a ban, and we will see examples on the newspapers reporting on it in a second, the public went and bought lots of copies of the single. Now, the single reached #1 in the non-official New Musical Express chart, but only #2 in the official record retailers and BBC chart. This led to accusations that the hidden hand kept the song at #2 behind the Rod Stewart single, not to offend and shame the monarchy and the Queen. The industry reported on the week ending with the single reaching #2 that it sold 150,000 copies, which is a lot, which on every other week would guarantee it a #1.
It's classic controlled conflict to create demand for the recording.
Yeah.
And to push what you're going to talk about in a little bit about the agenda behind the punk movement.
Yes. So I apologize for the quality of these images, but we have two headlines from the UK press on the week of the release of God Save the Queen. I think it was the second week because the song entered at #11 and then moved to #2, but never made #1. So on the left side, we see a headline which states Sex Pistols straight in singles charts at #11. This was on the first week, but the main headline is BBC plays TV and radio ban on the new single. So this is one headline, and on the right side, we see a report in the press that as of Friday noon, 5 days sales of Sex Pistols single, 150,000 copies sold, now total blackout. IBA advises don't play the single. And we see a photo of the Sex Pistols on stage. So this was in the media at the time of the Jubilee, and for audiences to go and buy the records, because obviously they couldn't hear it on the radio and not see it on Top of the Pops or any of the other music programs on television.
This is classic Streisand effect. So on the right it says the IBA advises don't play the single. What's going to happen? People are going to read that headline, especially the young people, and the first thing they're going to do is go buy and play that single.
Yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
Now, this is I'm showing you two versions of the cover. In the UK, I don't know how it was in the US, but when singles were released, there was sometimes more than one sleeve. So here we see the main sleeve on the left side, which I talked about earlier, the defaced face of the Queen. This is actually, I think, a picture from 1952 with the crown when she was knighted as the Queen. And you see the singles title God Save the Queen, the Sex Pistols. And on the right side, you see a different version of the sleeve. And then you see the pin on the mouth, which is a symbol of the punk movement, which we'll talk about in the second part of my presentation. And then you see on the right side, She Ain't No Human Being, which is a lyric, one of the pieces of lyric from the song. So controversy all over. And this was, if you people in the UK were going to record stores in late May and early June of 1977, this is what they found on the singles section. Now I want to talk about the more suspicions of fixes in the UK music scene. There were always rumors about more fixing and playing with the numbers in the UK charts. In 1978, for example, the Daily Mirror newspaper and the BBC nationwide television program were investigating the phenomenon called chart hyping, where record companies' representatives allegedly purchased records from chart return shops. If this was the case, sales figures of specific records were hyped, which advanced their chart positions accordingly. And I'll explain this paragraph in a second. I'm just reading the bottom part. In another 1980 documentary, A World in Action, more corruption was revealed in the UK music scene. Store chart returns dealers would frequently be offered bribes to falsify sales logs. So let me just explain briefly. When a record company services a record store or record stores all across the country, as also in the USA, or for that matter in any country, they're trying to guess how many copies would be sold, and obviously many singles and many albums are not being sold in full. So the record stores have to bring them back to the record company, okay? Because they have to make room in the stores for newer records, newer singles. So there's all kinds of inventory toying with the actual copies or how many copies were actually sold. So these two documentaries, which aired in the UK in 1978 and 1980, discussed how the connection between the record stores and the record companies were not all that, fine and legal, because some of the records were falsified. So again, this was done in order to hype the perceived popularity of songs for the public. More UK music fixes. We have this person, Dave McAleer, which is a well-known expert on the UK music chart scene. He has written or contributed to over 3 dozen music books about the chart history in the UK. Now, on his website, he writes about chart hyping, and he has this section which is called 50s and 60s UK charts, the truth. And he gives these examples. He's talking about two main methods that were employed with the ablest architects of high being top managers. He's mentioning Andrew Oldham, which is the manager for the Rolling Stones, and Don Arden, which is the manager for Black Sabbath and Yellow, among other groups. And he writes that they would hire teams of young girls to visit as many chart shops as possible by taxi, buying as many copies of the particular record desired to enter the charts. So by doing that, by buying more copies, and this is reported obviously to the industry, charts begin to advance in the listings on the chart, and they begin to become more popular and perceived as popular. So this was a method used by some of the top-ranked music managers. Tony Calder, an associate of Oldham's, employed a second method for bribing a staff member of one of the chart shops to list a record with false sales. And finally, a third method was to get a friendly member of one of the music paper chart compiling teams to give false points to a particular title. So we're seeing that there are all kinds of methods of playing with the numbers, playing with the figures, in order to gain publicity, in order for the public to notice songs. Now, obviously, the Rolling Stones, ELO, and Black Sabbath, they had great songs. But this is just an example of how the industry or the record managers used to promote songs and to help them, to push them up in the listings.
And this is a small example of two pop managers that were doing this. God only knows how many were involved in this.
So again, this is the cases that I chose for this presentation are only things that have been publicized and that we know about.
Okay, I'll move to the next slide for you.
So let's just sum up part one of the presentation. In the two biggest and most influential music markets, the USA and the UK, there were many attempts to control and rig the system of determining a song's popularity. Every factor considered for the popularity calculation, be it sales in stores or radio airplay, fell victim to an industry trying to control and shape public opinions and tastes. Several countermeasures were taken to try and fight this control, such as the Piola congressional hearings, but as we have shown in part one of this presentation, it is safe to say that fixes in the system took place all the time. This is not to say that there was no tremendous popular music in the manual tracking time period, but we will never know which records were honestly promoted and charted and which were not. It is possible that once the industry shifted by the early 1990s to a digitalized measurement of both radio, airplay, and sales in stores, the number of fixes was reduced. However, there are still ways to work around the numbers today, such as buying views on social media and other means. But this is, again, as you mentioned, Mike, this is a small sample of the cases that we know about, and we have no idea of knowing how many more cases were there.
Yeah, where there's money to be made, Ofer, as you know, there's going to be a lot of ambitious people trying to do things behind the scenes to make as much money as they possibly can. So with that, I guess we'll move over to part two.
Yeah. So in part two, I wanted to discuss how punk rock, the music genre, was manufactured. We'll examine how the punk rock genre entered the music scene in the mid-70s. We'll try to examine it through the story of its UK signature band, the Sex Pistols. And below you can see a cover of their only studio album, Never Mind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols. And we will examine more popular punk artists after that. Now, this is a brief overview that I prepared. This is something that you talked about in several of your presentations, Mike. So I'll just go through it and obviously just let us know your thoughts about this. The theory states that we're talking about the theory of manufactured musical genres. The theory states that many, if not all, popular musical genres were and are manufactured by the mainstream leading industry companies to make profits and promote social agendas. In memoirs, we are told that the Beatles were created to bring down Christianity. Also in memoirs, as well as in further outside research, other bands such as the Rolling Stones, we know that they were created to rival the Beatles, but were just another product of the same manufacturing musical line. Artists were bred, nurtured, or groomed by the industry, or if they started on independent labels, they were later bought by the big corporations. For example, Elvis recorded for Indie Sun Records at first, but then RCA bought his contract. Now, this part of the presentation discusses punk rock, which is only one music genre, but it is a genre which flourished in the mid to late 70s and examines information which supports the idea that it was another manufactured musical genre.
When you sent your presentation over, I was very glad to see that you were going to talk about punk rock, because to me that's the most obvious one to understand, being engineered and manufactured by the deep state.
So let's talk about punk rock as a case in point to manufacturing a musical genre. Social traits, we're talking about anti-establishment, rebelling against government, religion, parents, promotion of individual freedom, and do-it-yourself ethics. And by the way, when I read it, I immediately thought about Aleister Crowley's agenda, and we will talk about it in detail on the next slides. Presentation of new icons. This is similar to the introduction of Elvis in the 50s and the Beatles in the 1960s. We have groups and artists which define this genre. We have rude behavior, cursing on radio and TV appearances, and the punk fashion, tight pants, pins, accessories, shock-colored hairstyles. So this is just a brief background about punk rock and how it came about in the second part of the 1970s. Now, what musical traits? We're talking about songs that are very short and fast, under 2 minutes, and very loud, and songs with very rude lyrics. Now, on the right side, you see a copy of a sleeve of a cover of the LA punk band the Dickies, which record company A&M signed after dropping the Sex Pistols. And this single, which is called Banana Splits, which is a punk version of a children's song, it made the UK top 10 in 1979. This is just an example. The punk genre calls for some critical thinking. Question: why did established major and indie rock labels invest money and effort in creating an anti-establishment musical genre such as punk? Was there a social purpose, such as creating more social division, in addition to wanting to sell more records? And on the right side, we see the inside of the actual single, which was serviced to shops in colors. Obviously, the yellow color because it's all about a banana. But anyway, just going back to my question here. Now, I have nothing against criticism of governments, religion, and society, but here we have a case where we have a music genre which, for all purposes, called the youth to rebel and created social division in the UK in the beginning, and we will see examples of it in the next slides. Now, the story of the Sex Pistols. So the Sex Pistols were a very famous UK group from London. They were only active for 2.5 years between 1975 and 1978, and they became the punk signature band. Under the management of Malcolm McLaren, the band gained widespread attention from the British press after swearing, saying the F-word live on the air on the Today Show in the UK in a December 1st, 1976 television interview. So the band promoted their first single, Anarchy, in the UK, and was invited to the show as a last-minute replacement, that's what we are told, for rock group Queen. As a result, the group was banned after they showed up and cursed live on air. They were banned by many clubs and concert halls. McLaren explained that the band's name is derived from the idea of a pistol, a pin-up, a young thing, and a better-looking assassin. And then he added, it's a band of kids who could be perceived as bad. Now we know that vocalist John Lydon received his name Johnny Rotten, and bassist John Simon Ritchie was named Sid Vicious. And on the right side, you see a very famous first page from the Daily Mirror, which is a very popular UK daily newspaper. And the headline, the day after they appeared on the Today Show, was The Filth and the Fury. And by the way, this became the title of there were 3 movies made about the Sex Pistols. And this was the title of the 3rd movie, The Filth and the Fury, showing the picture on the first page. And then there's a title, Uproar as Viewers Jam Phones. So the viewers were jamming the phones of the BBC, complaining that the Sex Pistols cursed live on air on the morning show. So this was the claim to fame. This show on television. On one hand, it got them banned by many clubs and concert halls, but on the other hand, they gained popularity with the public.
Again, it's contrived conflict, and it's being promoted by the media to stir the pot. Clearly, one way to go about this was to not report it at all, and the Sex Pistols would have just went away. The media was making a big deal out of it because they were supposed to make a big deal out of it, and to promote punk rock, the genre, and the agenda, the social engineering agenda that goes along with it.
And again, I apologize for the picture on the top right-hand side, but this is the condensed poster of the second Sex Pistols movie, which maybe some of the people here saw, Sid and Nancy, about Sid Vicious and Nancy. We'll talk about what happened there. And the 3rd movie I'll talk about in more detail in a second. So I'm reading now from Rolling Stone Rock Almanac, which is one of the books I have. So on June 18th, 1977, the same month that God Save the Queen was charting in the UK, knife-wielding hoodlums offended by the anti-monarchy single attacked the group's Johnny Rotten on the London street slashing his face and hands. The following day, the band's Paul Cook will be jumped by another gang of royalists and beaten with an iron pipe. So we already see all kinds of shenanigans and with this group. And I'm continuing to read. Johnny Rotten announced the band's breakup in a US concert on January 1978. The other three members still managed to record songs for the group's movie, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, which we'll talk about in a second. On February 2nd, 1979, ex-band bassist Sid Vicious died at the age of 21 of a heroin overdose in his girlfriend's New York Greenwich Village apartment. At this time, he was charged with the murder of his former girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, in 1978. He was in and out of jails and detention centers, but his death left the murder case unresolved. In 1986, the film Sid and Nancy detailed their story. And finally, on February 26, 1979, in London, the Sex Pistols court case in which they and their manager, Malcolm McLaren, tried to divvy up the band's earnings so that the court case was running. It is revealed that only £30,000 are left of the band's £800,000 gross. So, and you'll understand in a second what happened there, because it is explained actually in the movie, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. But anyway, we see a lot of mayhem with this group. Now, another interesting thing about the Sex Pistols is the record labels. And I'm reading, although their active career lasted only 2.5 years, between mid-1975 to early 1978, the group managed to record on major and established record labels. The only studio album, Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, was recorded for Virgin in the UK and distributed by Warner Brothers in the USA. And this was in 1977. Their first single, Anarchy in the UK, was recorded and released by EMI, which we all know is the Beatles label and many other famous artists. So the first single was released by EMI in 1976. Later singles such as the Eddie Cochran song covers of Something Else and Come On Everybody were released on Liberty. This was in 1979. And in that same year, they covered a Monkey song called I'm Not Your Stepping Stone, and this single was released on the Call James label. Interesting fact, they also recorded a punk version of no less than Frank Sinatra's My Way, which appeared in their movie and movie soundtrack for Swindle. Final note, in a brief 2.5 years, they were dropped by and signed by 4 different record labels. But we see that some of these labels, such as EMI, Warner Brothers, and Virgin, of course, are major record labels.
It's amazing that all of these major record labels would be interested, especially when the band was just proving over and over again they were in self-destruct mode.
Yes. Now let's talk about this movie. I saw it in the cinemas in 1980. And of course, I didn't know what I know today. I was 15 back then. So, there was a lot of commotion. I mean, a movie about the Sex Pistols. And so we went to watch it in the cinemas. In 1980, a British mockumentary, or it was presented as a mockumentary movie called The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, came out, telling the brief history of the Sex Pistols and the manager Malcolm McLaren, born 1946, and he died in 2010. Singer and frontman of the band Johnny Lydon described the film as the vision of Malcolm McLaren, but having no shred of truth. The movie's plot is quite interesting, and pay attention now. McLaren is portrayed as the embezzler who created the band to manipulate them into the top of the music business, using them as puppets to further his agenda of cash from chaos. Sounds familiar, anyone? And we'll explain in a second. McLaren is shown as a crooked manager who also tried to claim the financial rewards the band received from the signed record contracts with the following music labels: EMI, A&M, Virgin, and Warner Brothers. In truth, the band was already formed when 2 of its members asked McLaren to manage them. However, does the film offer us more clues into the ins and outs of the record music industry back then? And let me just back up. So first of all, this movie was presented as a mockumentary, with mocking the Sex Pistols. But maybe, what we know now, they're showing us what they were doing. I mean, they had a manager which was embezzling the money. And it states that he was taking the approach of cash from chaos, which reminds us of order from chaos, which is Crowley's agenda. Now, what is cash from chaos? McLaren was actually saying, not only am I showing you that we're deceiving you, but I'm also going to make money from showing you this, because I'm going to make money. I made this movie to make money. So this is really, I mean, and obviously when I saw this film in cinemas in 1980, I had no idea. It was not a great movie by any means, but now, and this is, again, this is from Wikipedia and from other sources, this was the agenda. Cash from chaos. So we'll bring chaos, punk rock, the Sex Pistols, and everything that happened, but we'll also profit from it. So this is the story of the Great Rock and Roll Swindle, the movie about the Sex Pistols from the point of view of the manager. Now, I found this interesting comment also, Malcolm McLaren and his Crowley connections. This next excerpt is from a blogger called Torpedo the Ark. He posted this on December 1st in 2021, discussing Crowley's death day in 1947. Note, Malcolm McLaren, born a year before Crowley died, would also subscribe to this philosophy of spectacular failure and often mentioned the latter in conversation. Malcolm McLaren was very familiar with Crowley. We don't know more, of course, but McLaren also possessed a silver ring with the cult markings that the great beast, Aleister Crowley, had once owned. But he threw it into the ocean one day, having become convinced that it was bringing him bad luck. Or at least that this is what he told me when I asked him why he stopped wearing it. And this is an excerpt from a book, one of the biographies about Malcolm McLaren, which was issued in 2020. Now, I haven't read this biography, but I did manage to find this comment. And if you think about McLaren as being the promoter and manager of the Sex Pistols, cash from chaos, order from chaos, and we see now that Crowley was a big influence on him, it all ties up. And now let's talk about some other punk or top punk groups and the labels that sign them. And my point is that we see that major labels signed music groups, which many of you know, and promoted them. So we have the Ramones. I'm talking about now the USA-based, top punk artists. The Ramones, which were promoted and signed and promoted by Sire and Warner Brothers. Blondie on Chrysalis and EMI, the New York Dolls, Mercury Records, Iggy Pop and the Stooges, Elektra, Columbia, Virgin, Television on Capitol and Elektra and Ork, and the Patti Smith Group on Arista and Columbia. By the way, some of these groups, such as Blondie, they started as punk, but very quickly they switched to rock and disco. But most of these bands on this page, on this list, were considered at the time to be the top punk artists in the USA.
So I guess Cash from Chaos was a lucrative undertaking.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
So for the UK, we have some of the top punk artists. Again, I'm talking about the late 70s and early 80s and the labels that signed them. We have the Stranglers, which were on United Artists, A&M, EMI, and Parlophone. The Boomtown Rats on Mulligan and signed, but also on Mercury and Columbia. Elvis Costello and the Attractions were on Radar F-Beat, distributed by Warner. Now, Elvis Costello started as a punk artist, but very quickly moved to other genres. Very talented artist, of course. Susie and the Banshees, also from the UK. Polydor, Geffen and Sanctuary, and The Clash, which recorded for CBS, Epic, and Sony Music. Now, some of these companies were the recording, and some did the promotion that was split, or the groups moved from one company to another. But again, we see that major punk groups from the USA and the UK were signed by the major labels. And to conclude part two, Major record labels signed many top US and UK punk bands during the 1970s. While such bands had varied degrees of success, it is interesting that established major record labels chose to invest in the genre, supporting anti-establishment and anti-government ideas. This calls for some critical thinking regarding the initiation of the punk genre and the real social agendas behind it. Was it a valid criticism of society, of governments, and of social systems? Or was it a planned out way to cause more friction in society while selling records? So it's an open question, but I think that some of the stuff that I presented makes us think that a lot of these things were manufactured and promoted on purpose, not only to make money, but also to social engineer the public.
Yes, absolutely, Ofer. I agree 100%. It's a great example of another genre of music and what it was in place to do. And I think he did a great job of pulling this together. And even going back to part one, how the entire music system is manipulated as far as record sales and being at the top of the charts and all of that. The whole thing is just manufactured. So great job.
Thanks.
And thank you so much for getting back to me and reaching out to do the presentation. I really appreciate it.